The prison train, how one American turned a Nazi transport into his escape route. The cattle car reeked of human despair. Lieutenant Joseph Barrow pressed his face against the splintered wooden slats, gasping for whatever stale winter air could penetrate the suffocating darkness. Around him, 63 men were packed into a space designed for 8 horses. Some were already dead, their bodies propped upright by the sheer density of human flesh. Others had given up, their eyes vacant, waiting for the inevitable. It was January 1945, and Joe Barely was 20 years old. 3 weeks earlier, he had been behind enemy lines in occupied France, a paratrooper with the elite 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, the same unit that would later be immortalized as the Band of Brothers. His mission had been straightforward: drop into Normandy on D-Day, secure strategic positions, and disrupt German communications. What followed was anything but straightforward. Joe had completed 37 missions behind enemy lines. 37 times he had parachuted into Nazi-occupied territory, moving like a ghost through the French countryside, sabotaging supply lines, gathering intelligence, watching German convoys through the crosshairs of his rifle. He had blown up power stations in the dead of night. He had cut communication lines that left entire Wehrmacht divisions blind and deaf. He spoke enough German to pass checkpoints, enough French to blend with the resistance. But on his 38th mission, his luck ran out. The Luftwaffe flak had torn through his C-47 transport plane like a hot knife through paper. Joe felt the aircraft shudder violently as shrapnel ripped through the fuselage. The pilot screamed for them to jump. Joe didn't hesitate. He threw himself into the black void over France, his parachute blossoming above him like a white flower of salvation. Except salvation never came. German soldiers were waiting when he landed a reception committee with rifles and dogs. They had been tracking Allied drops for weeks, learning their patterns, their tactics. Joe barely had time to cut free from his harness before the first blow struck the back of his head. Then came the rifle butts, the kicks, the barking dogs snapping at his legs. What followed was a descent into hell that would test every fiber of his being. The Gestapo interrogation center in Rennes was a place where screams were currency and pain was the common language. For 7 days, they worked on Joe. They wanted names, drop zones, radio frequencies, anything that would help them anticipate the next Allied operation. They used methods that violated every convention of war, methods that reduced men to whimpering children begging for death. But Joe Barely gave them nothing, not a name, not a location, not a single scrap of intelligence that could endanger his brothers in arms. When the Gestapo realized they would extract nothing useful from this stubborn American paratrooper, they shipped him east, first to a transit camp, then to another, each one progressively worse than the last. With each transfer, the veneer of civilization peeled away a little more. The guards became crueler. The rations became smaller. The death rate accelerated. And now, Joe found himself on this train, this death train. The transport was bound for a place whose name would become synonymous with industrialized murder. A labor camp deep in the Reich where prisoners were worked to death in underground factories, manufacturing the very weapons that would be used to kill their liberators. The survival rate was less than 40%. Most men lasted 3 months before disease, starvation, or accidents claimed them. Joe understood with crystalline clarity, if he reached that destination, he would never leave it alive. The train lurched forward, its wheels screeching against frozen rails. Outside, the German countryside rolled past fields covered in snow, villages with their lights blacked out against Allied bombing raids, the occasional crater from an American or British bomb. The Third Reich was dying. Everyone knew it, but it was taking millions of souls with it into the grave. Inside the cattle car, someone began to pray. Another man sobbed quietly. A third started laughing, a high, broken sound that spoke of a mind that had finally shattered under the weight of too much suffering. Joe closed his eyes and thought of home, of Muskegon, Michigan, where Lake Michigan stretched to the horizon like an inland sea. Of his mother's cooking, his father's stern but proud gaze when Joe had enlisted, of the girl he'd kissed goodbye, promising he'd return with stories of adventure and glory. This wasn't the adventure he'd imagined. But Joe Barely had not survived 37 missions behind enemy lines by accepting defeat. While other men around him surrendered to despair, Joe's mind was already working, calculating, planning. He studied the cattle car with the trained eye of a soldier. The door was secured from the outside with a heavy bolt and likely guarded. The wooden walls were old but sturdy. The floor was covered in human waste and straw. There was a ventilation grate near the roof small, barely 10 inches across, designed to prevent suffocation but too small for a man to fit through. Or was it? Joe was lean from months of operations and weeks of starvation. He'd lost at least 30 pounds since his capture. His uniform hung off him like a scarecrow's rags. He looked at that grate and made a decision that would separate him from every other man in that car. He was getting out. The question wasn't if, it was when and how, and whether he'd survive what came after. Because even if he escaped the train, he'd be alone in the heart of Nazi Germany, with no papers, no food, no weapon, and no clear route to Allied lines hundreds of miles away. The odds of survival were infinitesimal, but infinitesimal was better than zero. As night fell and the train continued its inexorable journey east, Joe began to work. Using a scrap of metal he'd hidden in his boot, a souvenir from a bombed-out building that the guards had missed during their searches, he started to dig. Not at the door, which would be obvious, but at the screws holding the ventilation grate in place. Each turn of the makeshift screwdriver was agony. His fingers were numb from cold, his hands shaking from hunger. The man next to him watched with dead eyes, too broken to hope. "You'll never make it," the man whispered in French. "Even if you get through, they'll shoot you." Joe didn't stop working. He'd heard similar words before every dangerous mission. The old veterans, the cautious ones, always had reasons why something couldn't be done. But Joe Barrel wasn't looking for reasons it couldn't be done. He was looking for the one way it could. The train rumbled on through the frozen German night, carrying its cargo of the damned toward their appointment with death. Somewhere ahead lay the labor camp, the guards, the systematic machinery of extermination. But if Joe had anything to say about it, the train would arrive one prisoner short. The first screw came loose just after midnight. 3 more to go. Joe's fingers were bleeding now, the skin torn away by the rough metal, but he barely felt it. Pain was temporary. Death was permanent. And Joe Barrel had no intention of dying in a Nazi labor camp. This was just the beginning. The second screw fell into Joe's palm at 2:47 a.m. He knew the exact time because he'd been counting seconds, minutes, hours, anything to keep his mind sharp, to prevent the fog of despair that had claimed so many others in the car. Around him, the sounds had changed. The crying had stopped. The praying had faded to exhausted whispers. Now there was only the rhythmic clacking of wheels on rails and the ragged breathing of men too weak to do anything but exist. 2 screws left. Joe's fingers were beyond pain now, operating on pure will. The metal scrap had worn down, its edge dulled by friction against the screws, but it still turned. Slowly, agonizingly slowly. Each quarter turn felt like a small victory against the machinery of the Third Reich. The man who had told him he'd never make it had stopped watching hours ago. His eyes were closed now, his breathing shallow. Joe wasn't sure if he was sleeping or dying. In this place, the line between the two had become blurred. Dawn was perhaps an hour away when the third screw came free. 1 left. But Joe's hands had begun to shake uncontrollably. Not from fear, he'd mastered fear long ago during his first combat jump, but from simple physical exhaustion. His body was consuming itself, burning muscle for energy it no longer received from food. The Gestapo beatings had left internal injuries that throbbed with each movement. His ribs, at least 2 of them broken, sent white-hot spikes of pain through his chest every time the train lurched. He thought about stopping, resting. But rest was surrender, and surrender was death. The 4th screw was different from the others. It had been over-tightened, its threads stripped, and it refused to budge, no matter how much pressure Joe applied. He could feel the minutes slipping away. Dawn would bring guards walking the length of the train, checking the cars, counting prisoners. If they saw the loose grate, if they noticed the missing screws scattered in the straw. Joe closed his eyes and thought of his jump instructor at Fort Benning, a grizzled sergeant who'd made 2 combat jumps in North Africa and had lived to tell about it. He'd pulled Joe aside once after a particularly rough training session. "Birrell," he'd said, tobacco juice staining his teeth. "I've watched a lot of boys go through this program. Most of them are strong. Most of them are brave. But you know what separates the ones who come home from the ones who don't? It ain't strength. It ain't even courage. It's the ability to keep functioning when your body's screaming at you to quit. That's what'll save your life when you're behind enemy lines with a bullet in your leg and Germans on your heels." Joe opened his eyes and attacked the final screw with renewed fury. The metal strip broke, snapped clean in half, leaving Joe holding a useless piece of jagged steel. For a moment, just a moment, despair threatened to overwhelm him. He'd come so far, worked so hard, and now, then he noticed something. The screw, though still in place, had shifted, just slightly. The stripped threads had finally given way a fraction of an inch. Joe wrapped his fingers around the screw head and twisted. His blood, now flowing freely from torn fingertips, provided just enough lubrication. The screw turned. A 1/4 inch, a 1/2 inch, and then, miraculously, it was free. The ventilation grate lifted away in his hands. Joe stared at the opening. It looked impossibly small. A normal man couldn't fit through it. But Joe Birrell wasn't normal anymore. He was a skeleton wrapped in skin, a shadow of the 200-pound paratrooper who'd jumped into Normandy 8 months earlier. He looked around the car. Most men were unconscious or too far gone to care, but a few watched him with hollow eyes. One of them, a Polish officer who'd been captured during the Warsaw Uprising, nodded slowly. "Go," the Pole whispered in broken English. "Go for all of us." Joe positioned himself beneath the opening. The train was moving at perhaps 40 miles per hour, fast enough to kill a man who jumped wrong, slow enough to offer a slim chance of survival. Outside, through the gap, he could see the pre-dawn darkness, the silhouettes of pine forests, the occasional flash of a guard tower searchlight in the distance. He would have one chance, one moment, when the guards changed positions, when attention wavered, when the universe aligned just enough to let a desperate man slip through its fingers. Joe threaded his arms through the opening first, then his head. The wood scraped against his skull, tearing at his scalp. He ignored it. Using his core strength, what little remained, he pulled himself upward. His shoulders, always his broadest part, jammed against the frame. For a terrifying moment, he was stuck, half in, half out, completely exposed. If a guard looked up now, if someone spotted him, Joe exhaled every bit of air from his lungs, making himself as small as possible, and pushed. Something tore his uniform, maybe his skin, but suddenly he was through, lying flat on the roof of the cattle car, the freezing wind tearing at him like invisible claws. The train was moving through open countryside now. No tunnels nearby to crush him, no low bridges to decapitate him, but also no cover, nowhere to hide. When dawn broke in 15 minutes, he had to jump now. Joe crawled toward the edge of the car, each movement a calculated risk. The roof was covered in ice and frost. One slip and he'd slide off into the wheels below, a death as certain as any firing squad. He reached the edge and looked down at the ground rushing past in a blur of darkness. Every instinct screamed at him not to jump. It was suicide. The speed was too fast, the ground too hard. He'd break his neck, his back, every bone in his body. But behind him lay the labor camp, the gas chambers, the crematoriums, the systematic erasure of his existence. Joe Birrell had not come this far to die in a Nazi death factory. He thought of his mother one last time, sent her a silent apology for what he was about to put her through. First the telegram saying he was missing in action, then either another telegram announcing his death or, if God was merciful, a letter in his own handwriting explaining how he'd survived. Then Joe jumped. The moment his feet left the train, time seemed to slow. He was airborne, suspended between the machine of death behind him and the unknown ahead. The ground rushed up to meet him, frozen earth, patches of snow, the lethal promise of impact. He'd trained for parachute landing falls 1,000 times, feet together, knees bent, roll with the impact, distribute the force across the body. But those landings had come at terminal velocity with a parachute providing resistance. This was different. This was falling from a speeding train onto frozen ground in the darkness, with injuries already compromising his body. Joe hit the earth like a meteorite. The impact drove the air from his lungs, snapped his left arm. He heard it crack like a dry branch and sent him tumbling end over end down an embankment. Snow, dirt, rocks, and pain became an indistinguishable blur. He felt ribs breaking, felt something in his shoulder dislocate, tasted blood in his mouth. And then, finally, he stopped rolling. Joe lay motionless in a drainage ditch, staring up at the lightening sky. Every nerve in his body was screaming. His left arm dangled at an unnatural angle. Blood was pouring from a gash above his eye, running warm down his frozen face. But he was alive. Above him, the train continued its journey east, unaware it had lost a passenger. The sound of its wheels gradually faded into the distance, replaced by the chirping of early morning birds and the whisper of wind through pine trees. Joe tried to move and immediately regretted it. White-hot agony exploded through his body. The broken arm was obvious. The ribs, at least 4 now, maybe 5, made breathing an exercise in torture. His right ankle might be sprained or broken. He couldn't tell through the numbness. He'd escaped the train. That was victory won. But now came the hard part. Surviving. He was somewhere in Germany, possibly Poland, with no papers, no food, no weapon, and injuries that would have sent any sensible person to a hospital. He was wearing a ragged American uniform that marked him as clearly as a target painted on his back. German patrols would be searching for escaped prisoners within hours. Dogs would follow his scent. Soldiers would shoot him on sight. The smart move would have been to find a place to hide, to hole up and recover. But Joe knew he couldn't stay here. The train would be checked at the next stop. They'd discover his escape. Search parties would backtrack along the route. He had maybe 3 hours head start. Maybe less. Using his good arm, Joe pulled himself upright. The world spun sickeningly, but he stayed conscious through sheer force of will. He looked around, trying to orient himself. Pine forest to the north, open farmland to the south, east and west, more of the same. He had no idea where he was. No idea which direction led to safety. But standing still was death. So Joe barely chose a direction north, toward the trees, and began to walk. Each step was agony. His broken arm swung uselessly at his side. His ribs ground against each other with every breath. His ankle threatened to give out with each footfall. But he walked. One step, then another, then another. Behind him, the sun rose over Nazi Germany, illuminating a landscape of war and death. Somewhere in that landscape, American forces were fighting their way east. Somewhere, freedom still existed. Joe Barrel was going to find it, or die trying. And given what he'd already survived, dying was going to have to work a lot harder to catch him. Joe Barrel lost track of time, somewhere between the 3rd day and the 4th, or maybe it was the 5th. Pain had a way of distorting reality, turning hours into days and days into eternities. He moved through the German countryside like a ghost, stealing through forests, avoiding roads, drinking from half-frozen streams, eating whatever he could scavenge, frozen potatoes from abandoned root cellars, raw turnips from winter fields, once a dead rabbit he found that hadn't yet frozen solid. His broken arm had swollen to twice its normal size. He'd fashioned a crude splint from tree branches and strips torn from his uniform, but every jostle sent lightning bolts of pain through his nervous system. The ribs were worse. Each breath was a negotiation with agony. Sleeping was impossible. He could only rest in short, fitful intervals before the cold forced him to keep moving. He should have been dead a dozen times over. The German patrols nearly caught him on day 2. He'd been crossing a field at dusk when he heard the dogs. Joe had thrown himself into an icy creek, letting the water carry away his scent, then buried himself in a snowbank until the searchers passed. He'd emerged blue-lipped and shaking, hypothermia setting in, but alive. On day 3, or was it 4, he'd hidden in a barn while Wehrmacht soldiers searched the property. He'd covered himself in hay, barely breathing, listening to their boots crunch through the snow just feet away. A soldier had thrust a pitchfork into the hay pile, missing Joe's head by inches. When they finally left, Joe had discovered he'd been lying next to 2 other refugees, Polish slave laborers, who'd also escaped. They were both dead, frozen solid during the night. But it was hunger that was killing him fastest. The human body can survive weeks without food, but not when it's also healing multiple fractures, fighting infections, and burning calories just to stay warm in sub-zero temperatures. Joe could feel his body consuming itself. His thoughts were becoming cloudy, his reactions slow. Twice he'd hallucinated, seeing his mother calling to him from the tree line, seeing hot meals that vanished when he reached for them. He knew he was dying. It was just a question of whether he'd freeze to death, starve to death, or get caught first. Then, on what he later learned was the 6th day, Joe heard something that changed everything. Artillery fire. Not the distant rumble he'd been hearing for days, the Wehrmacht repositioning, fighting rearguard actions against the Allied advance. This was close, very close. Heavy guns, the kind that shook the ground and rattled your teeth even from miles away. And it was coming from the east. Joe's foggy mind struggled to process this information. The Allies were advancing from the west. The Americans, the British, the Free French. They were all pushing in from Normandy, from the Rhine. The Eastern Front was where the Germans fought the Soviets, which meant Joe changed direction, moving toward the sound of the guns. It was insane. He was walking toward a battle, toward the most dangerous place on Earth. But he was dead anyway if he kept running. At least this way he might find friendly forces, or what passed for friendly in this godforsaken war. The forest opened onto a valley, and Joe stopped dead in his tracks. Below him, spread out across the snow-covered landscape, was a tank battle of apocalyptic proportions. German Tigers and Panthers trading fire with Soviet T-34 seconds. Infantry in winter. Camouflage trading. Machine gun fire across frozen fields. Artillery shells shrieking overhead like the screams of dying gods. The snow was churned into a red and black slush, dotted with the burning hulks of destroyed vehicles and the scattered bodies of men who'd been alive minutes before. Joe had seen combat before. He'd fought in Normandy, in the hedgerows of France, in the frozen forests of Belgium. But this was different. This was total war, on a scale that beggared description. This was 2 empires locked in a death struggle, throwing everything they had at each other with the desperate fury of drowning men. And Joe Barrel, one American paratrooper with a broken arm and nothing left to lose, was about to walk into it. He started down the slope, waving his good arm, trying to signal that he wasn't a combatant. A German machine gun opened up, stitching the snow around his feet. Joe dove behind a destroyed Panther tank, his ribs screaming in protest. He lay there for a moment, catching his breath, wondering if he'd just made the stupidest decision of his life. Then he heard voices, Russian voices. 3 Soviet soldiers came around the tank, rifles leveled at his head. They were young teenagers. Really, with the 1,000-yard stare that Joe recognized from his own reflection. One of them barked something in Russian. Joe raised his good hand. "American," he said. "American paratrooper. Friend. Americanettes." It was one of the few Russian words he'd picked up from refugees during his escape. He had no idea if it would save his life or get him shot as a spy. The soldiers conferred in rapid Russian, One of them, the youngest, with a face that still had traces of baby fat despite the hollow eyes, stepped closer. He looked at Joe's uniform, at his jump wings, at the 101st Airborne patch barely visible beneath the grime and blood. "Americanets," the young soldier repeated slowly. Then, in broken English, "You, how, here, minus, Americanets. Minus O, you how, biases all, minus O, you how, here." Joe tried to explain the capture, the train, the escape, but his Russian was non-existent and their English was barely better. Finally, he just pointed west and said, "Escaped, Nazis, prison train." The soldiers understood that much. One of them grinned, revealing several missing teeth. He said something in Russian that made the others laugh, then gestured for Joe to follow. They brought him to a field command post, really just a collection of tents and vehicles clustered behind a ridgeline. A Soviet officer, a major with a face like weathered granite, looked Joe up and down with undisguised skepticism. Through a translator, a nervous Red Army private who'd learned English from American films, Joe told his story. The major listened without expression, occasionally asking questions, his eyes never leaving Joe's face. When Joe finished, the major was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something in Russian. The translator looked uncomfortable. "Major Golovin says your story is difficult to believe. Says maybe you are spy. German spy. Who speaks English." Joe felt his heart sink. He'd escaped the Nazis only to be executed by the Soviets as a spy. There was a certain dark irony to it. "I can prove it," Joe said desperately. "My dog tags, my jump wings. Ask me anything about the 101st, about American operations." More conversation. In Russian. Then the major stood and walked to Joe. For a terrifying moment, Joe thought he was about to be shot. Instead, the major extended his hand. "Major Golovin says, 'Welcome to Red Army,'" the translator said, relief evident in his voice. "Says any man who escapes Nazi death train and walks into battle is either bravest man in the world or craziest. Either way, we need men like this." Joe shook the major's hand with his good arm, barely believing what he was hearing. "You fight with us," the translator continued, "until we link up with your American forces, yes?" Joe looked around the command post. At the T, 34 tanks being refueled. At the soldiers cleaning weapons, checking ammunition, preparing for the next engagement. At the red flag with the hammer and sickle snapping in the winter wind. This was insane. He was an American paratrooper about to fight alongside the Soviet Red Army against the Nazis. Command would never believe it. Hell, he barely believed it himself. But what choice did he have? The alternative was to try to make it to Allied lines on his own, through hundreds of miles of Nazi-occupied territory, with no food, no weapons, and injuries that needed immediate medical attention. "Yes," Joe said. "I'll fight." Major Golovin smiled a rare expression that transformed his granite face into something almost human. He barked orders, and suddenly Joe was being hustled to a medical tent where a gruff Soviet doctor set his arm properly, taped his ribs, and gave him the first real food he'd eaten in a week: black bread, sausage, and vodka that burned going down but warmed him from the inside out. They gave him a Soviet uniform. It hung loose on his skeletal frame, and a PPS-41 submachine gun. The translator, whose name was Mikhail, stayed with him, explaining that Joe would be attached to a tank crew. "Major says you lucky," Mikhail explained. "Tomorrow we attack German positions. You get to kill many fascists. This is good, yes?" Joe looked at the submachine gun in his hands, at the Soviet uniform he was wearing, at the T-34 tank that would be his home for however long this arrangement lasted. He thought about how he'd explain this to his commanding officer if when he made it back to American lines. "Sir, after escaping from a Nazi prison train, I fought with the Red Army. They'd think he'd lost his mind. They'd probably court-martial him for fraternizing with the enemy. Except the Soviets weren't the enemy. Not today. Not when they were both fighting the same monster. Yeah, Joe said finally, a grin spreading across his face despite everything. This is good. That night, Joe Beryl slept in a Soviet tank, surrounded by Russian tankers who sang folk songs and passed around bottles of vodka, treating him like a curiosity and a comrade in equal measure. They gave him a nickname, Americanets, the American. Tomorrow, he would go into battle again, but this time, he wouldn't be behind enemy lines conducting sabotage. This time, he'd be part of a massive armored assault, riding a T-34 into combat against the very forces that had captured him, tortured him, and tried to work him to death. There was a certain poetic justice to it. As he drifted off to sleep to the sound of Russian voices and distant artillery, Joe allowed himself to hope for the first time in weeks. He was still alive. He was armed. He had allies, however unlikely. And somewhere to the west, American forces were advancing. Somewhere out there, his brothers from the 506th were fighting their way deeper into Germany. Joe Beryl just had to stay alive long enough to link up with them. How hard could that be? The T-34 roared to life at 0500 hours, belching black smoke into the pre-dawn darkness. Joe Beryl sat in the commander's hatch, the PPS-41 across his lap, watching the eastern horizon begin to glow with the promise of another day of war. Around him, an entire Soviet armored division was waking up hundreds of tanks, thousands of soldiers, all preparing for the assault that would carry them deeper into the dying Reich. The tank's crew had accepted him with the casual pragmatism of men who'd seen too much to be surprised by anything. The commander, a grizzled Ukrainian named Sergeant Krichevsky, who'd fought from Stalingrad to Berlin, simply shrugged when told an American would be joining them. American, Russian, Mongolian doesn't matter, Krichevsky had said through Mikhail's translation. You kill fascists, you ride with us. And kill fascists. Joe did. For 3 weeks, Joe Beryl fought with the Soviet First Ukrainian Front as they pushed west toward Berlin. He rode into battle on the back of a T-34, manning a machine gun, laying down suppressing fire while Soviet infantry assaulted German positions. He fought through villages where SS units made their last stands. He watched Soviet artillery reduce ancient towns to rubble. He saw things that would haunt him for the rest of his life, things he could never fully describe, even to his own family. The Red Army fought with a fury that shocked even a combat veteran like Joe. This wasn't the methodical combined arms warfare he'd learned at Fort Benning. This was vengeance incarnate. 4 years of Nazi atrocities being repaid with interest. The Soviet soldiers had seen their homeland ravaged, their families murdered, their cities burned. Now they were on German soil, and mercy was in short supply. Joe participated in the liberation of a subcamp of Buchenwald. The sight of the prisoners walking skeletons in striped uniforms, some so weak they couldn't stand, made him physically ill. He thought about the train he'd escaped from, about the men he'd left behind in that cattle car. Most of them were probably dead now, worked to death in some underground factory or gassed in some clinical efficient manner that reduced human beings to statistics. He thought about how close he'd come to being one of them. But Joe's luck, which had carried him through D-Day, through 37 missions behind enemy lines, through Gestapo torture and a leap from a moving train, was about to run out. It happened during an assault on a fortified German position outside a town whose name Joe never learned. His tank took a direct hit from a German 88mm gun. The shell punched through the armor like it was paper, and the interior of the T-34 became an inferno. Joe was thrown clear by the explosion. His position in the commander's hatch saved his life. But Sergeant Krichevsky and 2 other crew members died instantly. Joe hit the ground hard, his barely healed ribs breaking again, and lay stunned as German machine gun fire tore up the earth around him. A Soviet medic dragged him to safety, and Joe woke up 3 days later in a field hospital, his body a patchwork of old and new injuries. The doctor, a woman who looked too young to have the rank she wore, told him through Mikhail that he was being evacuated to a rear area hospital. War is over for you, Americanets. Mikhail said, genuine sadness in his voice. You have done enough. But the war wasn't quite over. At the hospital in Poland, Joe's case attracted attention. An American fighting with the Red Army was unusual enough, but an American paratrooper who'd escaped a Nazi death train and then volunteered to fight with Soviet forces? That was unprecedented. A NKVD officer, Soviet intelligence, interrogated him for hours, clearly suspicious. But Joe's story checked out. His dog tags were genuine. His knowledge of American military procedures was too detailed to be fake. And besides, the Soviet soldiers who'd fought alongside him vouched for his bravery. Finally, the NKVD officer made a decision that probably saved Joe's life. He arranged for Joe to be transported to the American lines. It took another 2 weeks. 2 weeks of being shuttled from one Soviet command post to another. Each officer unsure what to do with this strange American who spoke no Russian but had somehow become an honorary Red Army soldier. They treated him well, fed him, gave him medical care, even threw a small party where they presented him with a certificate signed by Marshal Zhukov himself, commending him for his service to the Soviet Union. And then, on a cold morning in March 1945, Joe Beryl crossed the Elbe River and walked into American lines. The GIs who found him thought he was insane at first. Here was a man in a tattered Soviet uniform, claiming to be an American paratrooper from the 101st Airborne, speaking English with a Michigan accent, but carrying Soviet identification papers. Son, the captain said slowly, clearly thinking he was dealing with either a lunatic or a very sophisticated spy. You better start from the beginning and explain exactly what the hell you are. So Joe did. He told them everything. D-Day, the 37 missions, the capture, the Gestapo, the train, the escape, the Red Army. He watched their expressions change from skepticism to amazement to something like awe. You're telling me, the captain said when Joe finished, that you escaped from a Nazi prison transport, wandered through Germany for a week with a broken arm, joined up with the Russians, fought in a Soviet tank, and then just walked back to our lines? Yes, sir, Joe said. That about covers it. The captain was quiet for a long moment. Then he started laughing, a deep, genuine laugh that spread through the assembled soldiers until everyone was laughing, not because anything was funny, but because sometimes laughter was the only sane response to the sheer insanity of war. Well, hell, the captain finally said, wiping his eyes. Welcome home, soldier. You've got one hell of a story to tell. But the story didn't end there. When Joe finally made it back to American command, he learned something that made his blood run cold. He'd been declared killed in action. His parents had received a telegram months ago, informing them that their son had died in combat. His mother had held a funeral service. His name was on a memorial wall. Joe Beryl was a ghost. It took weeks to straighten out the paperwork, to convince the Army bureaucracy that he was, in fact, alive. Letters were sent, phone calls were made, and finally, gloriously, Joe was able to call home. His mother answered the phone. Mom, Joe said, his voice cracking. It's me. It's Joe. I'm alive. The silence on the other end of the line lasted an eternity. Then he heard her scream not in fear but in joy, and then she was crying and laughing simultaneously, calling for his father, telling him that their son was alive, that Joe was alive, that God had answered her prayers. I knew, she sobbed into the phone. I knew you weren't dead. A mother knows. I knew you'd come home. Joe Beryl was discharged from the Army in 1945 with a Purple Heart, a Bronze Star, and memories that would last a lifetime. He returned to Muskegon, Michigan, married his sweetheart, and tried to live a normal life. But how do you live a normal life after surviving the impossible? For years, Joe didn't talk about his experiences. When people asked about the war, he'd give vague answers and change the subject. The memories were too raw, too painful. The nightmares came frequently: dreams of the cattle car, of the jump from the train, of watching his Soviet tank crew die in flames. But in 1994, something remarkable happened. Joe was invited to Russia to meet with veterans of the unit he'd fought with. The Soviet Union had collapsed, The Cold War was over, and now these old warriors could finally acknowledge the American who'd fought alongside them. Joe returned to Russia and was treated as a hero. He met surviving members of his tank crew's families. He visited memorials to the soldiers who died in the battles he'd fought. And he met with Russian officials who presented him with additional medals, recognizing his service to both nations. "You are the only soldier to serve in both the American and Soviet armies during World War II," a Russian general told him through a translator. "You are a bridge between our nations, a symbol of what we accomplished together." In his later years, Joe finally began to share his story publicly. He spoke at schools, at veterans events, at historical conferences. He wanted people to understand what that generation had endured, what they'd sacrificed, and how close the world had come to being consumed by darkness. "I was just trying to survive," Joe would say when people called him a hero. "I did what I had to do to get home." But it was more than that. And everyone who heard his story knew it. Joe Barrel represented something profound: the indomitable human spirit, the refusal to surrender even when survival seemed impossible, the courage to keep fighting when every rational calculation said you should give up. He'd been captured by the enemy, tortured by the Gestapo, loaded onto a death train, and written off as dead by his own government. He'd broken his body escaping, nearly frozen to death in the German wilderness, and then done the unthinkable. He'd picked up a weapon and gone back into the fight, not because he loved war, but because he loved freedom more than he feared death. Joseph Barrel passed away on the 12th of December 2004 at the age of 81. He was buried with full military honors. American and Russian flags draped over his casket, veterans from both nations standing at attention. His obituary in the New York Times called him the soldier who fought for two armies. But those who knew his story understood he fought for something bigger than any one nation. He fought for the belief that one person, no matter how beaten down, no matter how desperate the circumstances, could make a difference. That courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. That survival itself was an act of defiance against tyranny. The prison train that carried Joe Barrel toward death became his escape route to legend. The journey that should have ended in a Nazi labor camp instead became a testament to human resilience that inspired generations. And somewhere, in the quiet moments before sleep claimed him in those final years, Joe Barrel probably still felt the rumble of that train, still saw that tiny ventilation grate, still remembered the moment when he decided that surrender wasn't an option. Because some men, when faced with impossible odds, do the impossible. They survive. They fight. They come home. And they remind us all what the human spirit is capable of when pushed to its absolute limit. This is the story of the prison train and the American who turned it into his escape route. This is the story of Joseph Barrel, a paratrooper, prisoner, escapee, and the only American to fight for both the United States and the Soviet Union in World War II. This is the story of a hero who refused to die.